To discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio by the spokesman for the Syrian Negotiation Commission, Yahya al Aridi, and Osama Abo Zayd, a former spokesman for the Free Syrian Army. In Stuttgart, we have Kevork Almassian, founder of the alternative news website Syriana Analysis, and from Damascus is Syrian analyst Makki. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us. Yahya al Aridi, let me start with you. Bashar al-Assad's forces now in control of more than 60% of Daraa province. Is the revolution lost?
Not at all.
Why?
Because the struggle in itself between the regime and its people is not a military one in the first place. Those people, Syrian people, did not choose to carry weapons in order to get their rights, in order to express their freedom. The regime itself is the one that selected that. They have the future, all the future that you could think of in the world. And at the same time, we believe that there are issues in their minds that guarantee that they would never lose because they believe in their freedom, although they have been pressured, they have been under all sorts of brutality by the regime and its supporters, but the revolution can never stop, can never fail, because it is the revolution of a people who want freedom.
Okay, so Makki, the revolution or the revolutionaries might have lost the battle but not the war. Is that how you see it as well?
Well, I think the war has already been won by Assad and the Russians, and I think that, you know, if you're going to talk about a revolution, then you can't just talk about a political struggle, because this is a military battle. It's been a conflict since 2013. Now, the military conflict between the government and the opposition, the rebels, has been finished for a couple of years now, because Daraa is the final location in the south of Syria where the rebels would have a strong starting point to launch an offensive against Assad, and that's going to be lost because of the momentum gained by the Syrian army and the Russians. And you go back to 2015. Now, Assad and the Syrian government were losing the war in that period, at that time frame. It was the Russians, when they came in and the added firepower, which turned the tide of the war. Now, Daraa is going to fall sooner or later. It's inevitable. And after that, you're going to have the changing of the locations of the conflict from the south of the country to the north. Okay. And the north is going to be where the emphasis is going to be.
Okay, so let me ask Osama Abo Zayd, is that how you see it? Daraa's fall is an inevitability, and with that, there might be a displacement of the conflict, but ultimately Assad has already for a long time won the war.
It depends for who fight against the Syrian opposition, who negotiate with the Free Syrian army now in Busra al-Sham and Daraa. It's not the Syrian regime army or officers from Syrian secret service, regime secret service. We are talking about officers from Russian army. So that's very important point to know, to understand what's going on. We are talking about occupation in Syria. The Russian army who lead the battalions against the Syrian opposition, who negotiate with the Syrian opposition. So it's so important to understand what kind of conflict now we have in Syria. So to be honest, the understandings about Syria, it's fragile understandings. So 1 year ago, we have the de-escalation zone agreement between Russians, US, Jordan, about the south, and now the Russians destroyed this agreement. Right. So that's mean direct threat to Turkey, because of Turkey is the guarantors of the escalation zone and north.
Not much de-escalation in the de-escalation zone as things stand. Kevork, is that the truth? Without the Russians, Assad would have been long gone, and ultimately this is the Russians versus the opposition in all their shapes and colors.
Actually, this is a theoretical question. We don't know whether or not the government of Syria would have fallen in 2015 or in 2016 if the Russians didn't intervene at that time by the airstrikes against ISIS, al-Nusra, and other terrorist organizations. But we have to be careful in choosing the terminologies when we speak about, for example, the recent conflict in Daraa. In my opinion, this is a conflict between Syria and its allies, represented by the Russians, the Iranians, Hezbollah, and others, against the MOK, the office of MOK, which is in the operational room for coordinating the military affairs of the armed opposition groups in the southern part of Syria, including al-Nusra Front, which is on the terrorist list of the UN Security Council. And the de-escalation zone...
The American President Trump stopped MOK 1 year ago. So there is no MOK now. There is no military support for the Syrian opposition. So it's from the past. You have to update your information, I guess.
Excuse me, sir, I didn't interrupt you. This is only in the media that the MOK operation room has been dismantled. However, the Saudis, the Jordanians, and even the British, they still have the operation room, and they have military presence in Al Tanaf crossroads. And even Israel, yesterday, they opened the border crossing with the Quneitra, and they supplied the militants, including al-Nusra Front and ISIS, with logistical and military support. So we are not talking about the people against the government or a government against the people. We're talking about a proxy war between different powers. They are supporting different players underground, and eventually who is following the situation underground will understand that the Syrians and their allies are winning the war, and the opposition should not be arrogant in this regard. They should join the negotiation with the Syrian government in order to settle this.
This is interesting.
Where's Israel stand now?
I want to ask you, Kevork, just for clarification, because as far as I understood what you said, you were saying that the Israelis were funding jihadis to destroy the Syrian state. Is that what you actually really believe?
Yes, of course. This is not my belief, actually. It's even the UNDOF, the UN forces in the Golan Heights. They said that there is a regular meeting between the Israeli forces and these rebels, the so-called rebels in the borders with the occupied Golan Heights. And we all know that those who are occupying the area in that particular location is al-Nusra Front on the UN Security Council terrorist list, and Daesh and ISIS on the UN Security
Israel
Council terrorist list.
Al-Qaeda and Daesh, according to you?
No doubt.
There hasn't been?
No doubt. According to the UN,
no,
not according to me.
I think you're quote mining the UN there, but that's a different discussion. Anyway, I just wanted for clarification. You say the Israelis are supporting Daesh and Nusra Front as well. Yahya al Aridi, let me go to the broader argument of that. There's an argument from those who support Bashar al-Assad, who say that in Daraa particularly, it's jihadist laced. This isn't sort of mainstream opposition. These are jihadi groups, and they might be used as proxies by outside forces. Is that true?
Well, let me pick up on certain things that have been said just by your guest from the masks.
Yes, Danny Makki.
Right.
But answer the question first.
And I connect the two ideas together. Actually, there was a de-escalation zone in the south, which was different from other de-escalation zones in Syria. The difference lies in the fact that the United States is a factor in this. And at the same time, it is, with regard to geography, it's close to Israel. So the U.S. sent messages to those so-called rebels, to the opposition, to fighters, that the de-escalation zone in the south would not be harmed, would not be affected, and it is going to continue. Now, had it not been for the United States or Israel, this Russian invasion of the south of Daraa, in Daraa, and the regime and the Iranian militias wouldn't have happened. So there is, I believe, coordination, because the Americans also sent a message later on that, well, we have nothing to do with this. You remember when things are happening in Al-Ghouta, there was also a message in the south, because the people of the south wanted to come to the rescue and to help of Al-Ghouta. And they got a message that you don't create any sort of cause or pretext so that you can be invaded by the Russians or the militias. Now, this thing is not a proxy matter. It is not, it's not the regime and its allies. It is the allies of the regime, the Russians in particular, who are just doing this to Syrian people. Now, the conflict is really between Syrian people who wanted freedom, not Daesh, not Nusra. There could be certain spots here and there, but it cannot be the cause or the pretext for the displacement of 300,000 people. It cannot be the cause for the presence of tens of Russian jets bombarding that area. It cannot be the reason for massacres. So it is really a conflict between the people, the birth of the Syrian revolution and this brutal regime that is targeting its own people.
Danny Makki, if we accept the premise that Assad is surviving, at least for the time being, and that with Russian and Iranian help, he's going to stay the course. Let me ask you, you're sitting in Damascus right now. Was it worth it?
Well, it's definitely not a case of whether it was worth it, because you can't view wars in this concept. You've got to look at the time frame of how this war has developed, the low points the Syrian government had when it was close to falling, and the changes which were made which allowed it to be on this pathway to victory. It's not something which has happened overnight. The West had a huge opportunity to absolutely obliterate the ruling system here in Damascus. It failed to do so, and by allowing the Russians to come in, it's allowed the war to be changed.
Okay, but that's
tactical.
tactical.
I think in that perspective,
okay, certainly that's tactical. Let me ask it to you in a different way.
It's led to the situation we're in today.
Okay, so it's this has evolved over 7 years to the situation we're in. Hold on. Okay, hold on for a second. Let me ask you the question in a different way, more directly. With all the chemical weapons, with the barrel bombs, with all the slaughter and with the torture, there are those who believe Assad should be in The Hague and not president of Syria. Do you believe that he still has the legitimacy to be president of Syria? However we got here, in terms of how the war evolved with whoever's help, does he still deserve the legitimacy of being the president of Syria?
Well, the issue of legitimacy definitely goes back to the segments of the population here in Syria who actually support him. And you go back to who's giving him international legitimacy. Now, he's head of a sovereign country. He hasn't fallen. You've got the Russians, the Iranians, the Chinese, all sorts of countries supporting him on an international level. So definitely there are elements of legitimacy being given there on the international and on the local Syrian level. Now, if your question is in regards to will the West ever re-give this sense of legitimacy, I think, in terms of Damascus, the viewpoint from here, people here, and especially Assad and the government, couldn't care less over whether the West gives them or takes away legitimacy, because for them, it doesn't have a meaning after the West has been in essentially what is a war of attrition against them for 7 years.
Okay.
They view that the Russians are far more important than the Americans or the British or any of the other countries. Now, and if you look at the Daraa offensive now as an indicator, the US has essentially abandoned any hope opposition fighters had of winning or staging a huge last stand in Daraa.
So, there's a couple
that goes
things
directly back
there's a
to
couple
how
things to unpack
the US policy has abandoned the Syrian fighters it encouraged to rise against the government in the first place.
Okay, so Osama Abo Zayd, a couple things to address. Number one, do you feel abandoned by the US and the West? Maybe that's a point at which you and Danny Makki would agree.
Yeah.
Second point, can you ever accept Assad still staying as president?
For first point, yes, I agree. U.S. has no strategy, real strategy to support the Syrian opposition. The previous American administration, Mr. Obama focused on the nuclear deal with Iran without real support for the Syrian opposition. And Mr. Trump, the next administration, they directly, Mr. Trump, the first decision about Syrian issue stopped the support for the Syrian moderate opposition. So that's what I said. MOC and other operation rooms stopped since December 2017. So that's the first point. But to answer the second point or the second question, we have to think carefully about the Russians with the Russians airstrikes, with the 100,000 Shia militias fighters fight for Bashar al-Assad. You can win the war, the military war. But Russians is not, or the Iranians, Russians and Iranians, they are not useful tools to have stabilization in Syria, to enforce or to let the Syrian refugees in Germany, in Europe, in Turkey, and other states to go back to Syria. It's not useful tools to collect the weapons. Without justice, you cannot let the Syrian refugees back to Syria.
Can I throw something at you? I just read it just before I came.
Challenge.
Sorry, I read something before I came in studio. The Ministry of Expatriates in Damascus putting out a notice saying Syrians, you can come home.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
Bashar al-Assad, from the beginning of the Syrian revolution, I was in Syria. You know, I'm former detainee for 3 times. Last time I stayed in the Air Force intelligence jail for 1 year. I know this kind of promises by the Syrian regime. They promise us to stop killing the activists in Syria. They promise the Syrian people to have real constitution and real maintenance of the political regime in Syria, but nothing happened. What's happened is the Russians, Iranians came to Syria to fight for Bashar al-Assad and to keep this regime as Bashar al-Assad now doing, to keep him in the power, as Bashar al-Assad who's as dictatorship and
you think he can change at all, ever?
Yes, he cannot, and he will not. But he cannot be a president of Syria in future, because the main challenge I said, without justice, no one can enforce the Syrian refugees in anywhere to back to his homes. No one can enforce the people who has the weapons to accept the collect weapons, because without collect the weapons, you cannot have stabilization.
Okay.
So stabilization not only in Syria, it's about the region.
Okay,
so
got it.
That's
got it.
The main
Certainly. Kevork, no peace without justice, especially for those millions of refugees and those who have lost family members or those who have been tortured in Assad's prisons. Can you at least accept that?
Actually, we have to speak facts. We can say anything we want in the media, and we can claim anything we want.
So
in the last year, according to the UN numbers, more than 800,000 refugees and internally displaced civilians returned to Aleppo after the liberation in December 2016. Now, tens of thousands of displaced and refugee Syrians are returning to eastern Ghouta, and nothing is happening to these people. But they are also other kind of people, like your guest from, I don't know, from Saudi Arabia or from Turkey. If you put your hands with the enemy of Syria, for example, in the United States,
I'm from Daraa city.
We have Syrians.
7 kilometers to Bashar al-Assad Palace. 7 kilometers to Bashar al-Assad Palace. My apartment,
if you
7
are in
kilometers
any
to Bashar
government
al-Assad
and you
Palace.
put your
I'm
hands
Syrian,
with the hands of your enemy
I'm Syrian,
and try
I'm from
to overthrow
Daraa,
the
from
government
Damascus,
of your
from
country, you
Riyas
will be
Matar
arrested.
city, which is killed by Jamil Hassan in Air Force intelligence prisons. So please keep answer the question and don't talk about me or my city or where I'm from. Answer the question.
Please,
you cannot,
sir, I didn't interrupt you. I didn't interrupt you, so you have to listen to me.
Go ahead,
I didn't interrupt you, so I gave you all the opportunity democratically to express
your opinion. Okay, you have a chance,
opinion.
Kevork, go ahead.
This is the kind of a revolution. This is a kind of a revolution that you are trying to export to Syria. This is a new kind of dictatorship you are trying to build in Syria. That's why the majority of the Syrians are opposing to.
What?
You are not
because
accepting the other.
I have no barrels in my pocket.
The other side, not only
I have
for
no chemical weapons
not
here.
only for interruption. The people who oppose your narrative in Syria are being beheaded on daily basis. They are being stoned to death, whether it's in Daraa, whether it's in Idlib. This is not the kind of Syria that we want for the Syrians, for the 24 million of Syrians. We don't want a Wahhabi style of life in Syria.
Nobody here has given any inkling to being Wahhabis or wanting extremism. I want to wrap up with Yahya al Aridi very briefly, sir. Wrap us up. Where do we go from here?
I think we have before us 2 banks of the river. The narrative that's coming from your guests, when he just accused others of just being terrorists or being people unable to communicate or to deliver their messages properly, and they are exporting a revolution. No, we didn't export a revolution. People came out to the streets and asked for freedom. The regime cannot continue as such. because the files of crimes, the brutality that's being exercised, no Russia, no America, nobody, no Israel can help this regime and come back to power. We understand very well that had it not been for Israel, the regime would have gone, because there are people who are just working for Israel in Russia and people working for Israel in the United States. Now,
and I'd love to bring up the Israeli angle in a different discussion.
In a different discussion, but one final point about the supporters. Those around with regard to the support, local support for the Assad regime, we understand that it's out of poverty, out of fear. They cannot do anything, they cannot go out. Other people are displaced. Internationally, Russia cannot bring back the regime to rehabilitation, nor can the United States. There are international legality resolutions that would guarantee that such illegitimate, originally, and brutal and criminal regime cannot continue, and it would be the best prescription for outlaw in this world of ours.
Unfortunately, I've got to move on. Gentlemen, I thank you all sincerely for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Yahya al Aridi, Osama Abo Zayd, Kevork Almassian, and Makki. Thanks again.